But the homeless man who won the case took his victory in stride. Quote, "It's hard to get real excited about winning the right to beg," he said. Beggars Liberation? Conservatives say this is just the latest example of liberal lawyers turning society into a swamp of permissiveness and degradation, etc., 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 etc. Take it away, Pat.
Thank you, Michael. I think it's the rich and poor alike have the right to sleep under bridges, isn't it?
And beg in the streets.
Okay. William Kunstler up there in New York. Isn't Judge Leonard Stand's decision that begging is now a protected First Amendment right another clear example of the kind of judicial activism against which the American people democratically voted 3 times in the last 3 presidential elections?
No, Pat, he's following the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, as late as 1988, held that these vagrancy laws and laws prohibiting loitering for begging were all unconstitutional. So all Judge Sand is doing is following in the steps of a rather conservative Supreme Court majority.
Mr. Banzhaf, what do you think of that?
Well, if that was a Supreme Court ruling, we wouldn't need Judge Sand's decision. Judge Sand's decision would be meaningless. I think the Judge Sand is correct insofar as he goes. That is, that begging is speech. It's conduct and speech mixed together, but it's speech. But although I haven't read the opinion, it seems he didn't address the crucial question, and that is whether it is commercial speech. Because if it is commercial speech, 2 very recent Supreme Court decisions say, yes, we can restrict it. Yes, in some situations, we can ban it.
Mr. Kunstler, let me ask you. Suppose, do you think solicitations by a woman for prostitution is protected speech?
Well, I think that's a different matter, because there you're taking something that is illegal in itself, prostitution,
all right,
and saying solicitation for that is illegal. And I think that would probably be illegal, although it's even there a close call.
All right, let me ask you this. If, and everyone would agree that prostitution right now is illegal. Suppose panhandling were made illegal, then it seems to me you could control it that way, could you not?
Well, I'm not sure you can make panhandling illegal, because begging is a charitable contribution, and Judge Hand does address commercial speech. He, in essence, says that panhandling is no more than a charitable contribution. Everybody knows it's going to the single charity in front of them, but it's not much different than a charitable organization which makes at least 75% of its funds go to charity.
Bill, you're making...
Could they make panhandling illegal?
Yes. My organization, for example, does solicit. We are regularly regulated under the First Amendment by many different states and cities and the federal government. I think a better analogy would be the laws that we have against hitchhiking. It is illegal to stand on the side of the road, even safely on the side of the road, and hitchhike. After all you're asking for is a free ride. Now, if this decision is carried out, and the courts do not recognize that it is commercial speech entitled to far less protection, then we may have trouble limiting hitchhiking. We may have real trouble when 5 guys surround you in the middle of the night in Washington and say, give me all your money. And they try to prosecute him, and the court says, wait a minute, that's protected speech. You've got all these burdens to overcome.
Everyone recognizes that free speech isn't absolute. I can't say to you, I'll pay you $5,000 to murder Pat, and then say that's just free speech.
That's right, because it is an illegal activity.
But could they outlaw someone's right to just sit there without any sign or everything, just sit there with a cup and expect people to put in money?
I think you can make the soliciting for money or the giving of money in a public place to a stranger illegal, and that is one way then to make the panhandling illegal. The other is simply to say it's a commercial transaction. It is proposing a commercial transaction. It is done with a commercial expectation. Therefore, it is commercial speech. The Supreme Court in the last couple of years said you can ban even advertising for a gambling casino. You can ban Tupperware parties at a college dorm. Surely, then you can restrict this kind of commercial speech.
How much of a First Amendment absolutist are you, Mr. Kunstler? What do you think about these Supreme Court rulings banning commercial speech? Do you approve of them in the case when they're banning things you might like to see banned? For example, cigarette ads, things like that, gambling ads.
Well, I could make a case for banning some commercial speech, but that isn't what John is talking about. John is really doing a sort of a flip-flop here, because he's saying that hitchhiking can be made illegal, and we all know that because it interferes with traffic, it creates danger on the highways, cars stop, people get hit, people who are hitchhiking and people in the vehicles themselves. He also says you can limit commercial activities, and you can regulate commercial activities. But panhandling is not a commercial activity any more than charitable contributions are commercial activities. So to bring commercial activities into this is a red herring. This is not a commercial activity.
It is not a red herring. Charitable solicitation has always been regulated. It continues to be regulated. You point to various dangers of hitchhiking, but there are also dangers, as we know from people panhandling on the subway. We've had a couple of recent killings on the subway, intimidation, and that famous case you're involved with Bernhard Goetz. That to you would be a solicitation. Those poor little kids presumably were simply exercising their First Amendment right to ask Mr. Goetz for $5.
Is that the basis of your case? Is that the basis of your case?
That's another red herring, because what you're saying here is it can be regulated. That's what Judge Sand says. It can be regulated. For example, they cannot solicit within 25 feet of a token booth. Secondly, they cannot solicit on the cars, the subway cars themselves. Thirdly, they cannot solicit within 40 feet of a transit authority office structure, office store. There are certain regulations, and he leaves that open. Remember, this is only a preliminary injunction, and you can regulate as to time, place, and reasonableness. And that
Bill, would you go further and say that where the dangers can be shown, as we do with regard to hitchhiking, for example, that you can totally prohibit it in some areas, for example, in the New York City subway?
Well, not in all of it.
Why not?
Because the subways...
Is it commercial speech? Is it commercial speech? Yes or no?
It's not commercial speech, any more than you soliciting for your organization is commercial speech. And they can limit it to certain areas. They can limit it to certain times in the day and the night. There are limitations on it. It isn't just carte blanche. You can go through the subways. I've already said they can't do it in the cars, because the cars are considered dangerous. They can't do it.
Mr. Bansaf, your position seems to be that it can not only be banned in places where it's dangerous, but if the state simply felt like saying, we do not want any begging in public, it would be perfectly within the right of the state to ban all begging in public. Now, is that your position?
I'm not sure we could do it any place, anywhere in the public. What I am saying is that this is clearly commercial speech. Bill apparently doesn't recognize it. He says everything is red baiting. It can be severely restricted. What those limits are, we've yet to see. But certainly you could ban it in the subway.
But even you recognize
certainly you can ban it in a bus terminal. Certainly you can ban it anywhere where it creates a serious danger or risk to the public.
If you ban it for everybody, John, but the whole point that Judge Sand brings out is that the transit authority's regulations permit others to solicit. It's only the poor and the homeless that are prohibited from doing it. Others can do it, and charitable organizations do solicit in the subways. And it's not red baiting, it's red herring.
Red herring, red baiting, you use the two interchangeably, Bill.
No, I don't.
The answer is yes, you can ban it in the subways, and if it's necessary to protect the public health and safety, you can ban others. The difference here now is not First Amendment, but rather what we call equal protection, and that is an entirely different issue.
All right, speaking of equal protection, when we come back, we're going to ask whether how this ruling might affect someone like Donald Trump.
Bank is closed for the holiday.
You have reached Lucci Plumbing. I am indisposed at the moment.
Ever try to get help on a holiday or a weekend? It's nearly impossible, unless you're calling one very special number.
GE Answer Center, may I help you?
24 hours a day, even holidays, GE's Answer Center is there. Whether you're thinking of buying a GE appliance or already own one.
My son just put marbles in the ice maker.
Don't worry, ma'am.
The GE Answer Center never closes.
You know the National Rifle Association protects your Second Amendment freedoms. But did you know we also train Olympic shooters, teach firearms and hunting safety to hundreds of thousands of Americans, host competitive shooting events nationwide, train thousands of law enforcement officers, and support junior firearms and safety clubs all over America? That's the real NRA. I'm proud of it.
General Rent-A-Car has free unlimited miles. General has free unlimited miles. Coast to coast. Case to case. Close to close. Close to close. Coast to coast. You'll smile when you see General's low rates. Piece of cake.
Witness the unpredictable on CNN with a look at world events on Prime News and the people making news on Larry King Live. Then CNN's Evening News with the day's top stories. Real-life television, weeknights on CNN.
Welcome back to Crossfire. We're talking about an interesting ruling by a New York judge last week, a federal judge, that there is a constitutional right to beg. This judge threw out all the regulations against begging and panhandling in Grand Central Station and in the Port Authority bus terminal and so on and so forth. And we're asking, what are the limits of the First Amendment if this is free speech? And we're discussing that with John Bonshoff, who's a professor of public interest law at George Washington University here in Washington. And in New York, the famous William Kunstler, founder of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Now, Mr. Kunstler, this judge said in his decision that these people, although they were panhandling, were really sending a message. We're very poor. We're entitled to some concern. Now, if that is speech, what are the limits? Could Donald Trump have his limousine parked in front of a fire hydrant because that's sending the message, I'm rich and vulgar and I don't give a damn about anybody else? I mean, is that speech too?
No, he's obviously breaking a law, parking the vehicle in front of a fire hydrant. If he parked it on the street where it was legal, he could do that all he wished. These panhandlers are not breaking a law. We have no law against begging. We have laws against loitering for the purpose of begging, but not for begging, as Judge Sand points out. They're not loitering, they're begging.
But they're trying to make a law against begging. That was the whole point, and that was ruled unconstitutional. Now you're saying it's okay because there's no law against it.
Well, that's a circular argument. It's protected. You can't make a law, and you can't make a law because it's protected.
Well, I don't think you can ever make a law against begging, because I think begging is and the Supreme Court has held this, that charitable solicitation is a First Amendment right. It has First Amendment overtones, and it cannot be prohibited. Begging is a charitable solicitation, even though we know it's for one individual charity, the individual standing before you.
Let me ask about the
answer him for a minute if I can, because I think Mike's question really missed the point. I have no objection. I don't see any constitutional problem in a poor person sitting around and saying, I'm poor. A poor person showing how poor they are. A poor person arguing the federal government should do this or pass this tax or whatever. It is when you go that final step and propose a commercial transaction, please give me $5. You then cross that line from protected speech to commercial speech. It can then be regulated. That's the analogy, not the one that you're using.
Mr. Banzhaf, let me take up this question in New York. And Mr. Kunstler, you can respond to what he says. Apparently a fella got off that subway with his boy, 3 years old, and one of these homeless types came up to him, accosted him. The man wouldn't give him money. He spit in his face of the father of the boy. And so the father just set the boy aside for a minute, beat up the homeless person, threw him down, got his head on the grate and banged it until he killed him. Now let me ask you, where does this begging, like some of these homeless do, where does the point where it passes abusiveness, if you will, like the spitting surely would, to the point where it becomes an assault and where it's no longer protected? Or can a homeless individual come up and call you a lot of names, or call you names after you refuse to give him something?
Well, Pat, that's exactly the problem. A great big beggar, for example, coming up to a small person simply by demanding money can be very intimidating. Once you rule that as a constitutionally protected right, it becomes much more difficult to enforce laws against robbery and extortion. It becomes much more difficult for people like this individual, or Bernhard Goetz, to exercise his right to self-protection. Because in all of those cases, we're not talking about constitutional rights. Once the speaker is entitled to a constitutional right, it is very difficult then for any other law to overcome that.
All right, Bill, this is more in the realm not of that particular case. When does speech of a beggar become abusive to the point where it's intolerable and the individual, for example, can be moved not only 40 feet away, but gotten out of the subway totally?
I think that's a very common sense observation. By the way, the man you mentioned, Mr. Sumter, who killed the homeless man in, I believe, the Columbus Circle station here, the man was not begging. He's a known eccentric who spits at people and hits people, and that did not involve begging at all.
Well,
and that was an overreaction, an unfortunate overreaction.
Well, it was an unfortunate overreaction, but the so-called beggar apparently threw a right hand first.
No one's claiming there's a First Amendment right to spit at people and accost them and hit them.
But is there a First Amendment right to go up and put my face right in yours if I were much bigger than you and it was dark at night and say, Mike, I want $5? At what point do we cross that line?
Exactly. Well, there are a lot of difficult lines to draw in all the Constitution.
We don't like to make them constitutional rights.
But I don't think the difference between talking and spitting is a very hard line to draw.
No, but the situation that Bernhard Goetz faced, the situation that this gentleman faced, which was just described, do raise those issues. issues. Once you say theirs is a constitutional right, then the right of the person to exercise self-defense, which in New York you can do upon a reasonable belief that intimidation or robbery is occurring, that right has to be put back down because it's balanced against this First Amendment constitutional right. So it's not just a question of a lot of these people running around the subways and intimidating people. You are literally talking about making it far more difficult to prosecute in a court of law robbery. You're making it far more difficult for people to exercise their right of self-defense.
All right, Mr.
John, that's
patently
ridiculous. And Bernard Goetz is not an example. He shot 4 men, one of whom asked him $5. There never was any evidence whatsoever that anybody had a costume, that anybody had sharpened screwdrivers. All a mythology.
Bill, last time you and I were on the air together, I said that Bernhard Goetz will be found not guilty of any crime other than carrying a gun. You said it was ridiculous. Now you're eating your words. You're sitting up there in New York.
Tried.
You are suing Bernhard Goetz, who doesn't have enough money to be defended. You're doing it for your Center for Constitutional Rights. And the one thing which is absolutely clear is there is no constitutional right whatsoever involved in it.
Well, all I'm saying to you is that he had a jury in New York County which would have had a different result in the Bronx County.
We won that case, didn't we, Bill?
And he's in the Bronx County now. We'll see what happens there. We're not suing for the Center for Constitutional Rights. We're suing for Darrell Cabey, who will, for the rest of his life, be in a wheelchair and be mentally damaged by what happened to him, and who was nowhere near Bernhard Goetz, and he's the one that Bernhard Goetz said, you don't look so bad, so here's another, and severed his spine.
But if they had had a if the rule had been in effect then, that they had a constitutional right to come up and say, give me $5, the defense of Bernhard Goetz and anybody else who tries to defend themselves in that circumstance would have been much, much more difficult. They would have been up against a constitutional right, and that is my concern.
Mr.
But John, they're not defending, he wasn't defending himself.
Is it not a point, Bill Kunstler, that the American people are more and more tolerant, indeed enthusiastic about the Bernhard Goetz, Mr. Sumner, and the others who finally sort of take the law into their own hands when they're abused and accosted and carry out, if you will, vigilante justice?
Sure, I agree with you that the majority support that, but that doesn't mean it's right, and it doesn't mean that that support doesn't come from fear of crime in the streets, and I can understand that. But that's not the issue. That's not how we decide cases in the United States, but what the majority would do here or there. The majority thought segregation was fine for many years. The majority thought the world was flat for many years. It isn't the majority's viewpoint that counts. It's what's right.
Well, Mr. Kunstler, it seems to me that what's being done by judges like Mr. Sands is inviting exactly the thing you're condemning.
No, Pat, they're not saying that beggars can go up and be abusive or can punch people or attack people. Those are crimes, and they should be punished for those crimes. That's not the issue. And the two plaintiffs here and the class they represent are not persons who told Judge Sand they're going to punch people or intimidate people. If that happens, that can be regulated. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about...
Be practical for change.
When we come back...
I am practical. I live among beggars in Greenwich Village are all over the place.
When we come back, we're going to take up the question of whether or not the Salvation Army can be justly kicked out of your suburban mall.
Picture yourself.
Can you use this?
With the style that comes through. Picture yourself. Picture yourself.
Welcome home, son.
Picture yourself in Van Heusen.
All our science, our technology, our mathematics, somehow they add up to moments beyond any calculation.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
The greatest country music legend of our time, Johnny Cash.
I hear the train a-comin', it's rolling around a bend.
Burns, burns, the ring of fire, the ring of fire.
Now 36 unforgettable Johnny Cash classics on 3 records, 2 extra long play cassettes, and 2 giant compact discs.
Daddy sang bass.
Mama sang tenor.
How high's the water, Mama? 5 feet high. 'Cause you're mine, I walk the line. My name
Call toll-free 1-800-635-4800 or send $17.95 for records or cassettes or $22.95 for CDs plus $4 shipping to Johnny Cash, Box 989, Department C, Hicksville, New York, 11802.
Drew Barrymore, Hollywood's little girl, gets lost in drugs and struggles to come clean. Plus, actress Morgan Fairchild, tonight on Larry King Live, 9 Eastern on CNN.
Welcome back. We're talking about the newly discovered constitutional right to panhandle and beg in the New York subways, and perhaps your forgotten right not to be accosted. Mr. Banzhaf, I want to talk to you about the Salvation Army. Basically in, like, what's it, Georgetown Shopping Mall, is that the name of it? A private mall like that. Is the problem why the Salvation Army was thrown out because if they let them in under equal protection, they have to let everybody else in? I mean, can these malls keep charities out, or can they select the one they want to have, or do they have to have them all or none?
I think probably if it is a strictly private establishment, they can keep them all out. They can let in some and not the others. I think the problem is not so much legal, but practical. If they let in one, all the others are going to argue that they come in. And that's the problem we've had all along with Bill's argument. It's not practical. Yes, this ruling only permits speech and not harassment, but in order to stop harassment, the cops are literally going to have to catch these people in the act. As a practical matter, they can't. The only way to prevent the kinds of things we've been discussing here is a ban or a near ban on this kind of soliciting in subway trains and in subway stations.
Mr. Banzhaf, do you find it ironic at all the conservatives who usually make a big deal about being strict constructionists when it comes to the Constitution, no fancy elaborate theories, when it comes to the First Amendment, which says quite clearly no law abridging freedom of speech, suddenly they're full of fancy theories why it doesn't mean that, it should be very limited, shouldn't be interpreted broadly, and so on and so forth?
Well, I don't know. I want to criticize either liberals or conservatives. I come down the middle on the First Amendment. In many situations, I've been foursquare behind it. In this case, I think it went too far. There's an old saying, hard cases make bad law. I think Judge Sand bent too far in this direction. I think he'll be corrected. You know, the Supreme Court recently shut him down on another ruling.
Mr. Kunstler, what about that? Aren't conservatives two-faced when it comes to the First Amendment and the question of strict constructionism?
There's a tough question.
They certainly are, and John would
what
not
a surprise.
permit. John would raise hell if picketing was stopped, because he would say that picketers sometimes make strong, angry faces at passers-by. You can't do it. You can't stop the First Amendment just because there may be some hard looks or accosting or what have you. You can punish the accosting, but you can't stop the First Amendment because
you can't stop the First Amendment. You can stop it when it goes over the line and becomes commercial speech. Supreme Court has said so a number of times.
But this is not commercial speach. You keep saying that. The Supreme Court has said that it's not.
And that's why you're doing it. It's commercial speech.
Stop. You've said it's commercial. You've said it's not commercial many times. We got the idea. Thanks very much, John Banzhaf. Thank you, William Kunstler, and Pat Buchanan and I will be back in a moment.
Number 3. And San Francisco flaunts it after the 49ers bust the Broncos. Prime News is next. Join us.
Is it going to be scary?
There was a time when you had to prepare a child for exploratory surgery.
Will you stay there with me?
Calm his fears, soothe his anxieties.
Mom, I want to go home.
Come in. Comfort him when he imagined the worst.
Can I bring Sam?
Sure. Well, today it's a lot easier because the exploratory can be performed without a scalpel, without anesthesia, even without a hospital stay. If it's performed by the magnetic resonance imager developed by GE, a remarkably simple way to give doctors a clear picture of problems that could only be diagnosed before with conventional surgery.
It's not serious. He'll be fine.
Ready to go home?
The MR imager from GE. It makes looking inside the human body easier for everyone.
See, Sam, that wasn't so bad.
GE, we bring good things to life.
Well, the 49ers won.
Yay! Darn.
So McDonald's everywhere, even in Homer, Alaska, will honor the winners with the $1.09 McDLT.
Break out the Diet Coke.
But should Bronco fans lose just because their team did?
Yes!
Of course not. So they'll still get their 99-cent quarter pounder with cheese, even though they didn't win.
But we played our little hearts out.
A $1.09 McDLT and a 99-cent quarter pounder for a limited time.
We're going to watch the Super Bowl every week.
Dominique Wilkins,
Air Jordan, the league's best. Slam Jam 1990. Live at 8:35 Eastern on TBS tonight.
The Bulls and the Hawks only on TBS.
Tonight.
Michael, it seems to me the hypocrisy and inconsistency is on the part of the liberals. You say First Amendment is absolute, but Second Amendment, actually you can control the use of guns. Some can be had, others can be taken away. Where's the consistency?
Listen, I'm not an absolutist on either one, and I think I should point out, just as a card-carrying member of the ACLU, that the ACLU doesn't buy this theory either, that begging is a First Amendment protected right. But on the other hand, it was absurd for the Wall Street Journal, a leading voice of conservatism, to say this morning that we have a homeless problem today because the law enforcement system has collapsed under the weight of prosperous civil liberties, as if the fact that people are allowed to beg explains why there are beggars. That's ridiculous.
Good for the ACLU, but if the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law. If they'd left the states up to determine it for the states, we wouldn't have this problem.
You think the states shouldn't have to respect the First Amendment?
I think the Constitution should be respected.
From the left, I'm Mike Kinsley. Good night for Crossfire.
Here's for the 10th Amendment. From the right, Pat Buchanan. Join us tomorrow night on another...